Imagine waking up in a country where your biggest strategic asset isn't tanks, missiles, or oil. It's bread. Not because you have a lot of it, but because you control who eats and who doesn't. That was the Soviet discovery of the 20th century, that in a command system, the cheapest and most precise weapon you can deploy is calories. Not bullets, not propaganda, food. The USSR didn't start there. After the revolution, Bolshevik leaders liked to talk about grain, tractors, and electrification. Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country. Food in that story was a production problem. Grow more, distribute more, feed the workers, show the world that socialism delivers. But by the early 1930s, something darker had happened inside the system. The Soviet state had learned that once you monopolize production and distribution, food stops being a neutral good. It becomes a lever, a punishment, a loyalty test, a way to break regions that resist, classes that won't submit, and neighbors who might slip out of your orbit. 3 decisions taken in Moscow between roughly 1928 and the early Cold War turned food from a shared necessity into a programmable weapon. The decision to nationalize the harvest through forced collectivization and punitive grain procurement quotas, turning peasant subsistence into a hostage of the plan. The decision to lock people in place with internal passports, blacklists, and anti-theft laws, making access to food conditional on political obedience and geographic obedience, especially during the 1932-33 famine.
The decision to prioritize geopolitical and industrial goals over feeding the population, maintaining exports, and using food as leverage over allied states even when millions were at risk, treating grain as a foreign policy tool first and a survival good second, these weren't accidents. They were conscious choices inside a governance model that believed it could override economic reality with willpower, that it could treat food as just another variable in a plan. The core mechanism was simple and lethal. Abolish private markets for grain, centralize procurement and distribution in the hands of the state, tie access to rations, movement, and relief to loyalty, compliance, and strategic priorities. Once you do that, hunger stops being an unfortunate failure. It becomes a policy instrument. The man-made Soviet famine of 1932-33, the Holodomor in Ukraine and related catastrophes in Kazakhstan and other regions, wasn't just an agricultural disaster. It was the moment food became a tool of systemic punishment and control, killing millions while the state continued to requisition and even export grain. Today, we like to think we've grown out of that logic. We talk about global food security, humanitarian corridors, and international law. And yet, states still impose export bans on grain when prices spike, pushing the shock onto poorer importers. Blockades and sanctions still target ports and payment systems that move wheat, fertilizer, and cooking oil. Great powers still treat food supply chains as bargaining chips in larger strategic games. The decision to weaponize food didn't die with the Soviet flag. The law the Soviets discovered, that when one actor controls the calories become a weapon, has simply gone global. This is not just a story about 3 decisions taken in Moscow 90 years ago. This is a warning about what happens anytime a system convinces itself that food is just another input in a political spreadsheet, rather than the basic constraint that defines whether societies hold together or break. To understand why these 3 decisions were so dangerous, you have to look at the system that made them possible. In a market economy, food is politically sensitive but structurally decentralized. Millions of farmers, traders, millers, and retailers make decisions. Prices move. If one region fails, another supplies. States can intervene through subsidies, stockpiles, tariffs, but they don't literally own the harvest. The Soviet Union set out to change that.
By the late 1920s, the leadership had decided that to industrialize at breakneck speed, the state needed full extraction rights over the countryside. Grain wasn't just food, it was fuel for the entire project. Feed the cities, feed the army, export to earn hard currency for machinery. Use the surplus to finance steel, dams, and factories. The peasantry, in this logic, became a tribute base. Stalin himself spoke of the need to squeeze the village to pay for heavy industry. That's where the governance flaw creeps in. Once you treat food as a central resource to be requisitioned for higher goals, you face a choice. Do you respect the limits of what the land and the people can sustainably produce? Or do you set quotas to match your ambitions and punish anyone who fails to hit them? The Soviet answer was the second. The first 5-year plan's drive for collectivization was sold as modernization. consolidating scattered peasant plots into mechanized collective farms, raising yields, ending kulak exploitation. In practice, it was a violent nationalization of food. Private grain markets were crushed. Wealthier peasants, kulaks, were deported or shot. Villages that resisted were hit with harsher requisitions. When you do that, when you abolish independent producers and outlaw independent trade, you create the technical conditions for weaponizing food.
The state knows who produces what, at least on paper. The state decides how much each district must surrender. The state decides who gets rations, who gets relief, who gets nothing. You haven't just nationalized farming, you've nationalized hunger. Add to that a second layer of control, the passport and propiska system, introduced in 1932-33, which tied people to specific places, restricted movement to cities, and allowed authorities to expel undesirable elements from rationed urban centers. Now food isn't just scarce. It's something you can only access if the system recognizes you, approves you, and lets you stay where the rations are. Finally, overlay a third layer, monopoly control of foreign trade and the choice to keep fulfilling export commitments even during internal crisis. Soviet records show millions of tons of grain exported in the early 1930s, even as famine spread across key grain-producing regions. At that point, food is no longer an organic constraint. It's a programmable variable. You can starve a village by raising its quota, starve a city by purging it of ration cards, starve a republic by extracting grain and sealing the borders, feed foreign clients while denying relief at home. The systemic failure here isn't just cruelty, it's the belief that you can endlessly trade calories for control, sacrifice human resilience now in exchange for state power later, and never pay full price. That's the mathematical flaw, treating food as if it obeys politics rather than biology. When we talk about food as a weapon, we're not talking about a metaphor. We're talking about a set of governance decisions that deliberately turned a biological necessity into an instrument of policy paralysis and sovereign risk, and ultimately contributed to the collapse of the USSR itself. Now let's walk through the three decisions that locked this logic in. The first decision was Stalin's choice, from about 1928 onward, to turn the countryside into a tribute engine for industrialization through forced collectivization and grain requisition. In the late 1920s, the leadership convinced itself that peasant farmers were, quote, hoarding grain, sabotaging industrialization and resisting socialist transformation. The solution was dekulakization and collectivization. Break private peasant households, seize land and livestock, and herd people into collective farms, kolkhozs, and state farms, sovkhozs. On paper, this looked like a rational modernization of agriculture. In practice, it was a war on the village. Grain procurement quotas were set unrealistically high, often detached from actual yields. Officials were rewarded for meeting or exceeding quotas, punished for falling short. Local activists and security forces were sent to sweep villages for hidden grain, tearing up floors, seizing seed reserves, and confiscating food from peasant homes. In Ukraine, the North Caucasus, Kazakhstan, and other grain regions, this was catastrophic. Evidence from demographic and economic studies suggests that even in bad harvest years, local production could have sustained the population if requisition and export had been reduced. The famine wasn't just about weather. It was about deliberate over-extraction. This is where food crossed the line from resource to weapon. When the state knows there is not enough to feed everyone, but still insists on meeting quotas, it is choosing who will starve.
By refusing to lower procurement targets, by maintaining export flows to fund industrial or geopolitical goals, by treating any attempt to keep back food as speculation or sabotage. In late 1932, Moscow tightened the screws. The infamous law of 5 years of grain imposed harsh penalties, including execution, for even small thefts from collective fields. Blacklists and blockades were imposed on villages and districts that failed to meet quotas, cutting them off from trade and supplies. At that moment, hunger became an explicit tool of discipline. You weren't just hungry because the harvest was poor. You were hungry because someone in an office had decided your area was underperforming and needed to be squeezed harder.
This is the first Soviet decision that turned food into a weapon, to treat the harvest not as a shared survival baseline, but as a physical expression of loyalty to the plan, and to punish disobedience with starvation. Today, whenever a government sets export targets, biofuel mandates, or fiscal goals that effectively prioritize beans for fuel or earnings for creditors over food security, it is flirting with the same logic, pretending calories are just another number in the model. In the 1930s USSR, that pretense killed millions.
Once you've nationalized the harvest, the second decision follows almost naturally. You have to decide what happens when hungry people start moving. During the famine of 1932-33, starving peasants did the obvious thing. They tried to get out. They walked toward the cities, toward border regions, toward anywhere that might have food. In a market crisis, that's part of the adjustment. People move, labor shifts, local shortages are mitigated by migration and trade. The Soviet response was the opposite. In December 1932 and early 1933, the regime introduced a new internal passport system and residence permits. Passports were required to reside in major cities and regime industrial centers. Peasants, by default, weren't given these documents. Many who had already fled to towns were expelled. Scholars of famine describe this as a kind of social cleansing. The authorities used the passport system to clean cities of starving rural migrants and hangers-on in the ration system, pushing them back into the very districts where food had been confiscated. At the same time, borders of key regions, like Soviet Ukraine, were tightened. Decrees restricted travel out of famine-hit areas. Train stations were monitored. People without proper papers were turned back.
This is decision number 2, to criminalize the basic survival strategy of the hungry, movement, and to use identification and residency rules to trap vulnerable populations in zones of deliberate over-extraction. Food here is weaponized not just by taking it away, but by blocking any escape from where it has been taken. Now add decision number 3. While all this was happening, while peasants starved, while children died and villages emptied of seed and livestock, the Soviet state did not treat food as a purely domestic emergency. It treated it as a strategic asset in a wider portfolio of goals. Grain exports did decline during the worst famine years, but they did not stop. In 1932-33, the USSR still shipped out more than 1 million tons of grain abroad. Historians have pointed out that the amount exported could have fed millions for a year.
At the same time, what relief did exist was often tightly controlled and politicized. Aid was allocated through party channels, sometimes focused on strategic industrial centers and loyal cadres rather than the worst affected rural districts. Foreign relief offers were rejected or minimized, in part to preserve the regime's image and monopoly on information. Later, in the Cold War, the logic extended outward. Through organizations like Comecon, the USSR used food and raw material trade with Eastern Bloc states to deepen dependency, offering cheap energy or grain to compliant allies, tightening supplies and credits for those that drifted. Food and fuel became fused as tools of bloc management. That's decision number 3, to treat food flows as instruments of geopolitical leverage and industrial strategy, even at the cost of domestic resilience, feeding the map, not the people. Put decisions 1 through 3 together, and you get the full architecture of food as a weapon. Nationalize the harvest and over-extract from problem regions. Trap populations in place with documents and borders, blocking their exit from hunger. Use the remaining surplus to serve higher goals, exports, allies, industrial priorities, even when the biological bottom line is flashing red. And this is where the modern parallel comes into focus.
Whenever a state uses export bans to protect domestic consumers while pushing shortages onto poorer countries, uses blockades, sanctions, or payment restrictions that knowingly cut off food imports to civilian populations, uses food aid as a bargaining chip, conditional on political alignment, military basing, or voting patterns, it is replaying fragments of the same script. The system may be different, the rhetoric may be softer, but the underlying governance pattern, calories as leverage, not as a non-negotiable baseline, is the same. The Soviet Union showed us where that path leads when taken to its logical conclusion. So, what do we do with this history beyond being horrified by it? The easy moral is don't starve people. But that's not a realistic operational rule for systems that face real shocks, droughts, wars, financial crises, pandemics. The harder, more useful lesson, the resilience takeaway, is this. In any complex system, the moment food becomes primarily the tool of control rather than a baseline to protect, you are already trading institutional resilience for short-term power. The Soviet Union's 3 decisions didn't just kill millions, they also hollowed out the legitimacy and adaptability of the regime.
By destroying trust between countryside and state, by showing that loyalty guarantees nothing when quotas don't care about reality, by saturating the system with lies about harvests, stockpiles, and famine deaths that could only be maintained by censorship and terror. When a state uses hunger as punishment, it deletes one of its own strongest stabilizers, the sense that whatever else happens, we don't let our people starve for political convenience. In modern terms, systemic resilience around food means diversification, multiple sources of supply, both domestic and external, so no single actor can flip a switch and starve you. Transparency, honest statistics about harvests, stockpiles, and prices, so you can see a crisis coming before it explodes. Depoliticization, treating core food flows like infrastructure, roads, water, electricity, rather than like bargaining chips. You can still regulate them, but you don't threaten them casually. Safeguards against weaponization, legal and institutional norms that make it harder for governments to impose collective punishment through hunger, whether against their own citizens or others.
That doesn't mean markets solve everything. Markets can fail and they can be ruthless. But the Soviet case shows what happens when you swing to the other extreme, when a single center has the power to decide who eats and who doesn't, and no independent institution can say no. At the personal level, this isn't about hoarding canned food or predicting the next famine. It's about understanding that food security is not a background variable. It's a primary indicator of how your system really works. When leaders talk casually about using exports, sanctions, or blockades as tools, they're often talking indirectly about who will miss meals when the policy hits. The difference between a temporary shortage and a weaponized famine is governance. Who decides, with what information, under what constraints? The 3 Soviet decisions that turned food into a weapon weren't anonymous glitches in a distant dictatorship. They were the logical moves of a system that believed it could subordinate biology to ideology, human metabolism to plan fulfillment. It got away with it for a while. Then the bill arrived. In corpses, in shattered villages, in a delegitimized state that eventually couldn't hold itself together.
If you want to understand the fragility of any modern system, yours included, don't just look at GDP, stock indices, or defense spending. Look at the food map. Who controls the land? Who controls the logistics? Who can move and who is trapped? Who gets fed first when things go wrong? And who is left to starve? Because the hidden maw behind the Soviet story is brutally simple. The moment a regime discovers how cheap and effective food is as a weapon, it also starts writing its own obituary in the calories it withholds from the people it governs. And if you want to see those fault lines before they crack your own system, before export bans, price spikes, or blockades turn policy into hunger, that's what we do here, inside the Soviet economy.